Because it hasn't happened for years. Oh, now we're live streaming already.
Don't worry. Don't worry. Do you want to take a little bit of time just to like gather your thoughts and stuff like that, or are you happy to stay on? Like we can.
I can turn off my screen and turn off the sound and just come back on it at 5 minutes.
Yeah, shall we do that 5 minutes before?
Yeah.
Yeah, no worries then. Okay. Good morning to everybody who has come to the webinar on time. I'm noticing that a number of people are just coming in as it got closer to 10 o'clock, and I imagine that a number more people will be coming very shortly. At the same time, we're scheduled to start at 10 a.m. And with respect to our participants and to our guest speaker for our lecture today, we will commence the webinar now. Welcome everybody to today's webinar with the title Gender and Development, History, Theories and Issues. I'll introduce myself first. My name is Rebecca Meckelberg. I'm a lecturer at the Interdisciplinary Faculty at Universitas Kristen Satyawacana. I will be the moderator for the lecture today. And today's webinar is one in a series of lectures organized for the 65th anniversary of Universitas Kristen Satyawacana. We have a special guest presenting our lecture today on gender and development. I'd like to introduce Dr. Melissa Johnston, who is also a colleague and friend of mine from Australia. Dr. Johnston completed her PhD at the Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University in early 2018. After completing a postdoctoral appointment at Monash University, Melissa was appointed as a lecturer at Melbourne University and is now about to take up a new position as lecturer at the University of Queensland. Melissa was recently awarded a DECRA, a highly prestigious award, the Discovery Early Career Researcher Award from the Australian Government, which she will be commencing in the new year. Melissa's scholarly work applies a gender lens to examine the links between security and political economy of development in order to better understand both women's and men's experiences, especially in conflict-affected environments. In today's webinar, Mel will examine some of the key lessons for gender and development scholars working in diverse areas of the social sciences, nearly 60 years after the emergence of the first groundbreaking theories on women in development. Her lecture will look at feminist questions that are not limited to how we might just mainstream gender issues, or as Mel refers to, add women and stir, but rather will pay more careful attention to how globalization has both challenged and reinforced patriarchy. Melissa's presentation today will be around 25 minutes, and then we will have time for questions and discussions until about 10 past 10 in Western Indonesian time. So without further ado, Melissa, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm really excited to speak to you all today about gender and development history, theories and issues. And 60 years after the groundbreaking theories of women in development, what are the key lessons for gender and development for scholars working in diverse areas of the social sciences? So my main points here today are to sketch some reasons why development and gender need to be seen together, and to show how I mobilise some of these feminist theories in my own work. First, historically, there are really important links between women's emancipation and development, even though both development and women's rights expansion have been very uneven. Second, the two streams of women in development and gender in development encourage us to think about material factors of gender, money, labour, burdens and benefits. And third, I'm going to leverage from some of that historical base to talk about three main theories I find useful in my own work: patriarchy, the gender division of labour and social reproduction. I'll draw on two papers making these points. The first paper is on gender and microfinance in Timor-Leste, and this was published in Review of International Political Economy last year, and it actually just won a prize for a best political economy paper by an Australian scholar a few weeks ago. The second paper I'm going to draw some examples from is one on COVID and gender in the Asia Pacific, and it was just published a couple of days ago in Pacific Review, so it's really hot off the press. So when we start talking about development and gender, I think it's important to think about development, history and patriarchy kind of all together. When we're talking about gender and development, we're implying two things: that there's a time element, developing in what direction, and that there is a political element. Gender says what about societies. So the key point that I'd like to make here is that patriarchies all look a little bit different, but they have as their main feature the dominance of men and the subordination of women. We know, however, that this is not a God-ordained or predetermined order, partly because every patriarchy is different, and partly because we can look at historical shifts from matrilineal and matrilocal systems to patrilineal and patrilocal systems. So as agriculture develops, and with it more complex systems of social hierarchy, so too does the gap between men and women get further apart. Now, I'm not saying here that before agriculture we have a sex egalitarian system. Non-agricultural societies also feature hierarchy based on sex, and matrilineal societies still exert violence and control over women. But rather, what we see with the development of sedentary agriculture is the solidification and institutionalization of control over women. That is, we see the real institutionalization of patriarchy. So patriarchy systems, just to take one step back, are those that privilege fathers, uncles, brothers, men, and communities of men over mothers, aunties, daughters, wives, women, and communities of women. And it's that institutionalization and socialization that we call patriarchy. And it's important to recognize that patriarchies are actually, in fact, political systems, because they give power to some people and they make other people do more work and give less power to those.
Oh yeah, that's very good. That's very true. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, can I just ask that people turn their microphones off? Thank you. We're holding questions to the end, right, Rebecca?
Yeah, sure.
Time is the next meeting.
Sam, can you turn your microphone off? Thank you.
Yes, Sam, turn off your microphone.
Okay, good. So to get back to patriarchy and what it does and how it's political, I'd also make the point that patriarchy is actually...
Oh my God.
Oh, who is that?
Yeah, Sam, why are you doing this shit?
Can I keep going? Do you think?
Keep going. I'm going to try and do something now.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I'll keep going. Sorry, guys. So to go back again to patriarchy being a political system, I'd also make the point that patriarchy is older and more insidious than capitalism. And in fact, you know, it's been around a longer time than liberalism, than neoliberalism and fascism. It's very resilient and very hard to shift. But there have, however, been challenges to patriarchy and these kind of older modes of organising human society. They really start to fracture.
Excuse me, Melissa. Excuse me.
Yeah.
So sorry, I have a quick question. You're very
Sorry, no, we're leaving questions until the, I'm really sorry, we're leaving questions to the end.
Oh,
Sam,
please continue. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, if everybody could just hold their questions until the end, I'd rather not be interrupted by men during my speech on patriarchy.
Well, Melissa, it's pretty important. Like, I'm sure you can understand.
Who is this guy? Is this a Zoom bomber?
I want to.
Sorry, can I please ask the host of the forum to exclude Sam Jacobs? Please put him out of the webinar. Okay, I'm really apologize for that, Mel. I didn't have host control, so I couldn't.
Right. Let's see if we can start again, huh? I mean, start from this part about patriarchy and political control. Thank you all very much for your patience with those interruptions. So yeah, just basically that it's an older system and more insidious, in fact, than liberalism and fascism and all these ideas around politics that we have in our heads. Actually, patriarchy goes back a lot further than a lot of these ideas that we think are really crucial to shaping our political world. So it's always important to think about how it's foundational, right? So we see these really start to fracture with the expansion of capitalism and industrialization, and these changes wrought by imperialism. So from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, then, we get a huge number of women who start to be educated. Prior to that, it's really only men who have access to education in any form, and it's with the development of writing and political manifestos by women that we begin to see the beginning of what we would call something like a feminist consciousness. So I think this feminist consciousness is very important to recognise as being part of development outcomes for women and how that's linked to education. For instance, of course, in the case of Indonesia, we have at this early period the emergence of the figure of Ibu Kartini, who is able to make the argument against colonisation and for women's rights and education, precisely because she has an education and she can read and write. We see also parallels in the US with large numbers of women getting educated in girls' schools in the 19th century and making an argument for the inclusion of Black women in education systems as both teachers and students. And this kicks off a huge amount of social change, both in terms of gender reforms and in terms of the civil rights movement. The emancipation of women is really key to nationalist movements and anti-colonial movements throughout the world in the earlier 20th century. So we begin with this education and participation of women, and we can see a lot of these nationalist and anti-colonial movements really take off and become successful. So for that reason, those historical trajectories of feminism and their interlocking nature with different kinds of social political movements, very important to understand. So the reason I talk about patriarchies in this long human history and then about development of feminist consciousness through the expansion of education is to show their importance for gender and development. So all these discussions in my mind of development need to be aware of the thousands of years of the history of patriarchy, and which also explains to us why it's so hard to shift these attitudes. Male supremacy is long embedded. But when we get these women's education movements across the globe, we get rising feminist consciousness and feminist women like Kartini, like these women in the US, who are able to push for changes to politics and economics. So after these early movements in the 20th century, the anti-colonial ones and the nationalist ones, we hit a bit of a watershed moment with the expansion of second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s. This sees the development of a real political force that changes international development quite markedly. It changes our understandings of labour movements, of sexuality and male power in politics, and changes key institutions. And one of these key institutions that feminism changes and questions and challenges is in the development banks. So in the 1950s and 60s, in the so-called Green Revolution, the World Bank, bilateral development organisations and others promoted the use of new seeds, new farming equipment and new markets for cash crops. These were supported by large country loans from the International Monetary Fund. Feminists noticed that this change in agricultural systems from one where women were workers, producers and consumers to one where there were new machines and new technology that were given expressly to men meant that men, not women, tended to benefit from this green revolution. At this time, we get Esther Boserup and other feminist scholars arguing that women being excluded from these agricultural labour and seed markets and so on really makes a difference for women's empowerment. Boserup argues that women need to be explicitly included in such markets and in agricultural development in order to reach full equality. As you might imagine, in the same way, in this green revolution, that farm equipment and seeds and so on went to men, the credit also went to men. And again, feminists working in this space argued that women needed access to these credit markets as well. So this leads to a kind of complex interaction in this period of time in development history. While feminists really want women's incorporation into these markets and into production, there were also substantial critiques of women in development or this inclusion agenda. On the one hand, it was argued that if we include women in markets, in these labour markets, agricultural markets and credit markets, they'll be able to create income and provide for themselves and their families. A woman will try and maximise her utility and create an income. This was all seen as very beneficial, and it was seen as having a flow-on effect to economic growth in general. So that's what's called the efficiency argument for women's economic empowerment, and it's a broadly used argument and still used today quite a lot. On the other hand, feminists also noted that when women are incorporated into markets, they do so under very unequal conditions. That is, they're expected to work for money as well as care for family for free. And these are conditions that men generally do not face. So part of the critique around women in development led feminists to reconceptualize the idea of gender. So we get this new idea of gender in development, or GAD as it's commonly known, emerging in the late 1970s against a backdrop of socialist feminist critiques. So GAD's emphasis is less on integrating women within the frame of existing development institutions and projects than transforming the very way in which we conceive development. And this requires going beyond women, beyond adding women and stirring, to an active engagement with the relations of power that reproduce the unequal and inequitable status quo. And this came to depend, in this theorisation, on the mobilisation of a new concept called gender relations. Gender relations definitely goes beyond women. It's talking about relations of power. It's talking about very precisely this relationship between women's subordination and male domination, and how that relationship is produced and sustained over time. It also notes that structures of power in different areas, the ideological, the economic, the political, the social, and see how these work together to reproduce this unequal status quo. So with that history part of the lecture over, now I'm going to move to theories and issues and how I mobilise some of the key lessons from this women in development, gender and development kind of trajectory. So what I take forward from this trajectory from women in development to gender and development is a need to look at the material factors when we look at gender. That means looking at the everyday lives of women, but also, you know, like people from GAD tell us, at the power relations. So three theories I find useful for this are the gender division of labour, social reproduction, and patriarchy. And my work is very much informed by looking at these material aspects of gender relations. So I'm always looking at money, at violence, and at work. I do think ideology is important, but it's not my main focus in my work itself. So let's go first to the gender division of labour. A significant aspect of how gender power relations work is through the gender division of labour, and that refers to the unequal spread of benefits and burdens of work between men and women, and the valorisation, or making more important, the work associated with men, and the denigration or making less valued work that is associated with women. So work associated with women is typically which is connected to sexual reproduction or to care work, and tends to be unpaid or even underpaid. And this gender division of labour can be seen strongly in the patriarchal household, the sort of traditional one, and association of women with care work and the private sphere results in systematic devaluation of women's work in general. Even though we know about this gender division of labour, it still remains largely unaddressed in development. And women's work burdens in Asia Pacific and elsewhere have been historically under-recognised, and that is still a problem for scholars and practitioners in this space. So let's look at how I operationalise gender division of labour, looking at this COVID paper that we just had in Pacific Review. So gender division of labour is very sharp in health. It results in what Harman has called this conspicuous invisibility of women in health. It's a central paradox. Women are conspicuous and visible in their delivery of care, and thus in the delivery of health, but are invisible to the institutions and policies that design and implement global health strategies. So at the beginning of the COVID outbreak, there was a moment where feminists like myself and Rebecca speculated that COVID-19 would force a reset towards a recognition of women's unpaid work, and that it was then patently clear to everybody that society depended on this essential work and depended on the work of, you know, feminized and undervalued workforce. But instead, as the pandemic progressed, research and modelling showed that actually the greatest job losses were in female-dominated industries, like in education, hospitality and retail. Women were very hard hit by increasing work burdens, especially in that female-dominated workforce in the health sector, and also by school closures and lockdowns overall. So in health, as well as in development more broadly, the unequal and consistent gender division of labour, where women are responsible for care work, that's housework, childcare, meal times, healthcare, and men can and do ignore and do not undertake that labour, requires actually for us as much attention as the inclusion or exclusion of women from labour markets. So it's not just a matter of adding women. There are loads of women who work in healthcare, for example, but when we look at this sector, we need to take into account the relations between men and women that accord women a greater share of the burdens and give men more privileges from the gender order. So overall, when we look at the gender division of labour, we just need to recognise that women's inclusion alone is not enough to improve economic outcomes. Across all sectors, women do not enter labour markets on equal terms, unfortunately. But for that reason, as scholars, we always need to be looking at men and women's experiences of labour differently and see how those experiences are different. So I'm going to talk now about the second tool that I find very useful for gender and development, and that's the concept of social reproduction. I think it's a really good way to break down how the gender division of labour works in the broader social structures like capitalism or the state. Social reproduction is defined as the reproduction of social life, which includes biological reproduction, so having children, the unpaid production of goods and services in the home, social provisioning such as voluntary work to maintain communities, and the reproduction of culture and ideology. The labour of social reproduction consists in a variety of socially necessary work that provides the means to sustain and reproduce the population, including the work that needs to go on to reproduce the worker itself that works in capitalism. So social reproduction is by and large undertaken by women. It's always in demand, but typically unrecognised, undervalued and unsupported. Social reproduction is outside the production boundary. That means that it's excluded from when we calculate gross domestic product, right? Gross domestic product then, as a measurement of development, neglects the values and the costs of social reproduction and is therefore, in my mind, and the mind of all the feminist economists, an inadequate way to measure work in the economy. National labour market surveys judge those doing most of the society's unpaid reproductive labour as economically inactive, despite the fact that those people, often women, are engaged fully in a range of work such as care of children, of other family members, making up shortfalls in inadequate state services. So this lack of valuing and material support for social reproduction disproportionately impacts women and is a key part of gender inequality. So social reproduction researchers like myself use what we call a materialist lens to conceptualise the relations between gender oppression and capitalism. That is, we seek to explore how the uneven distribution of resources between people shape the power relations between individuals and between groups. At the macro level, like the big level, this means exploring how the reproduction of the capitalist system sustains the drive for accumulation of economic resources and is therefore essential to its functioning. The gender dynamics in these systems are global and they look different across different societies. And so we can talk about what we could call, the political economists call, variegated social reproduction. So at the micro level, we can look at an example like microfinance. This is this article from a review of international political economy. Microfinance sets up a direct relations between the owners of capital and the borrowers of capital, facilitating the extraction of money from poor borrowers at high interest rates. In the case of Timor-Leste, we see this extraction happen from poor women in rural areas and in urban areas as well, from poor women, Timorese women, to those financial institutions. microfinance, which is a much loved development tool, instead of increasing the poor's access to capital and therefore improving incomes, has instead strengthened the economic control of Timorese village elites over poorer villages by rendering the debt relations between those different groups more formal. What I say in the paper basically is that these microfinance transactions don't take place in the realm of voluntary beneficial exchange. It's not really a free market, but instead the microfinance debt and borrowing and so on takes place within hierarchical class and gender structures. And because of this, the money generated by everyday work by women is transferred through these very high interest rates from poorer women in Timor to relatively wealthier sections of Timorese communities, and from those communities onto the world financial market, into those financial institutions. So through this, we see how everyday work of social reproduction, women's labour, women's work, is transformed into profits and into money. So we see how that social reproduction then links with different kinds of capital, in this case, financial capital. So social reproduction as a concept for us in development is always linked to how it works in other kinds of production, right? And that's why I find it very useful. The third and final theoretical concept that I find useful in my work in gender and development is the big one. It's patriarchy. So patriarchy is the manifestation and institutionalization of male dominance over women and children in the family, and the extension of that male dominance over women to society in general. So it implies that men hold power in all the important institutions in society, and that women are deprived of access to that power. As Lerner notes, the patriarchy does not imply that all women are always totally powerless, but that male domination and female subordination changes and requires specification. As scholars, we have to document and describe where and how this looks different in different places. So patriarchy, as Candiotti also famously argues, involves bargaining, wherein women have some agency to maximise their security and life options, even within those concrete constraints of patriarchal rules and norms that vary across time and place. So for us scholars working in gender and development, we can simply ask, where are the women? And we can often generate new insights by asking this feminist question alone, where are the women? But if we want to move to a deeper level of analysis, that's that one of gender as a relationship with power, we need to really make sure that we are looking at how those power relationships actually function. We need to look very closely at how patriarchy functions. For instance, it takes real power to exclude women and to maintain their subordination to men. It doesn't just happen accidentally, right? Patriarchal systems are resilient and require analysis of the circulation of power and knowledge that maintain that gender inequality. And for that reason, we can't just focus on the inclusion or exclusion of women. We need to look at how the patriarchy is functioning to maintain that inclusion or exclusion, right? So I think some of this can be quite useful when we look at COVID, for instance. Health institutions leading the response to COVID have developed historically as patriarchal institutions. Men have dominated the knowledge production of medicine, inside medical practice and inside the policies. Hegemonic masculine ideal types surround our ideas about what is a medic, what is a doctor, who is a global health expert, and these stereotypes shape the development of public health responses. Conversely, gender expertise, by which I mean expertise informed by an understanding of those unequal gender relations as shaping health access and outcomes, have generally been excluded from these policymaking organs of global health. So, and because of this inclusion and exclusion, the inclusion of masculine ideal types and the exclusion of gender expertise, we see how patriarchy is institutionalized in that health and development space. For example, in the paper, we talk about silences around COVID and violence against women. The necessity of including gender expertise on violence against women in global health approaches becomes very apparent when we examine the narrative and the data on the gendered nature of the pandemic. At the same time, this pressing need was initially ignored in institutions of global health responding to COVID-19. The WHO actually excluded recommendations about violence against women until April 2020, when they were giving advice on COVID, which meant that technically no state or UN agency had any advice on what to do about violence against women and COVID until quite late in the pandemic. So when we look at the interaction of patriarchy and development, we need to be aware of how it leads to contradictory outcomes. In our world, globalization both challenges and reinforces patriarchy. On the one hand, women's access to labour markets allows them to engage directly with capitalism and not have to work or have that relationship mediated by husbands and fathers, etc. They get control basically over the products of their labour. On the other hand, global institutions can reinforce patriarchy, for instance, ignoring this gender expertise that predicted a spike in domestic violence during lockdowns and so on. So to my mind, and this is the concluding part of the talk here, to my mind, we need to think about gender and development in very specific ways that take into account these historical trajectories. Challenging patriarchy is not new, but the organised challenge and breaking apart of patriarchy that we do see over the last couple of hundred years is new. And it's also not straightforward. Capitalism and development provide opportunities to women, but also find new ways to exploit them. And it's our job as scholars and practitioners to know and to challenge precisely the specific forms of patriarchy and gender relations that emerge in our time. So basically, these three lessons that I've been talking about today is that we need to recognise there's an unequal gender division of labour in both global and local workforces, and we need to know as scholars exactly under what terms women are engaging in selling their labour. We can measure this, as researchers with things like time use surveys and so on. The second important lesson is we need to know what kinds of social reproduction are taking place, under what kind of circumstances, and how this affects the relationship between women and capitalism. And this will be different in different places. And the third, we need to know what have been the historical unequal power relations between men and women that shape political and economic access and outcomes. In other words, always ask yourself, what is the current form of patriarchy and how is that interacting with capitalism and globalization, or with any particular mode of governance or production and so on. So I think that I'll leave it there. It was very, very nice to have talked with you all now for the last few minutes. I'm looking forward very much to your questions.
Thanks so much to Melissa for that presentation. Even in a short time, Mel's been able to cover quite a lot of ground for us in terms of her lecture. And I think some of the things that when we think now about discussion and the questions that people might have, I think it's been really useful how Mel has situated her presentation in, first of all, looking at the history of scholarly approaches to how we understand women in development, and including explaining some of the reasons for why gender or women and development need to be analysed together. And I think some of the histories that she outlined about the links between women's emancipation and different approaches to development and their relationship with some of the histories of anti-colonial struggles and independence struggles was really useful and important. And for those of us present today who are in Indonesia, certainly some things that we need to think about. Mel has summarized at the end the 3 points that she shared with us about her theoretical approaches, looking at questions of gender division of labor and the unequal spread of the benefits of work, social reproduction, and how does the gender division of labor work, where it neglects the labor and costs of work in the economy, in specifically reproductive labor, and then also discussing patriarchy. And I think one of the questions that Mel raised there, when we talk about patriarchy, it starts to explain to us why, when we look at questions of women development, asking the question, where are the women, is not enough. We have to acknowledge and we have to develop our critical analysis of the power relations that exist in our society, where there is an institutionalization of male dominance over women and children in the family, and where men hold power in most of the important institutions of power, in different national and global institutions, and that as a general phenomena, women do not have access to these institutions. So now I will open the floor to questions from our audience. You can either raise your hand and ask a question directly to Melissa, or you can put your question into the chat.
Happy to hear any and all questions. I'm not sure how much gender expertise is in the room. I'm sure there's gender experts here, but yeah, happy to hear any kind of question, right? No nervousness needed.
Yeah. Or even if there are participants in the forum today whose own scholarly work relates to questions of gender and development, and there are questions that you have, I'm sure Mel would be very happy to engage with those questions also.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Maybe Ibu Rebecca, while waiting for more expert questions, let me kick off. Thank you very much, Melissa, for your presentation. We are here together with many staff and students of Satya Vaityana Christian University. If you think about fostering, promoting the women and gender and development agenda at universities, what are the things that first come to your mind? What can universities do? And both then looking at it internally, for example, by starting courses on gender and development, having participation of women students and lecturers, and maybe also the role of universities with respect to gender in wider societies. Maybe it's a broad question, but I find it particularly interesting to get your views on the role of universities in this process. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, Henry. And I think you kind of ask it because the answer is kind of inside the talk that I just gave, right? Because I do think, you know, we often poo-poo education and say, well, education isn't enough. You know, we can't just educate women and expect the world to change. But in fact, when we look at this longue durée, this longer history, we do see that education plays such a crucial role in the development of feminism and then of women's emancipation. And of course, women's emancipation, you know, the freeing of women from some forms of patriarchy, we could consider to be the most important social revolution that's actually ever happened, you know, because never has there been so many people freed from domination as during feminist movements of the last couple hundred years, right? And universities play a huge role in that, right? You think about Simone de Beauvoir being at the French universities and being able to talk with her contemporaries and so on to transform the ideas around psychoanalysis and what we think about sex roles. Think about Kartini being able to write and therefore being able to question and challenge colonialism in that way. So we shouldn't underestimate our own role as institutions, I think, in feminist movements. I guess I would say, with those broad brush things out of the way, in one sense, I think, yeah, that it's not enough to just include women. I don't know what the statistics are like in Indonesia, but in Australia, for instance, we have maybe 70% of graduates are women coming through universities, and we see actually a bit of a gender split in that we have more women graduates than ever, and yet the gender pay gap remains, right? So it's not just enough to add women and stir. We have to ask, what are the power relations inside the university? And that I don't know what your department, maybe you can comment, Henry, you know, how many people are you promoting in your university who are women into those key leadership roles? For me, that's an important point with the transformation of universities and having a better lens for that. And the second thing, I don't know what the Indonesian universities are like, but I think I know that the Indonesian universities play a big role in development in general, in doing monitoring and evaluation, in helping roll out different development programs across the archipelago. So my feeling is that making sure that those attentions to gender relations of power when those research programs are rolled out, when you do those kinds of studies or baseline studies and so on, is really important that you've got good gender expertise on the ground going into rolling out those programs. So there's sort of 3 points.
May I follow up, Melissa, Rebecca?
Yes, certainly.
You made a very interesting point. I'm from Amsterdam and the Free University, although I live now in Indonesia. The majority of students at the Faculty of Economics in Amsterdam are indeed female. And I think the same is true for the economic faculty at Satyawacana University. But do you think we have also made steps forward in addressing the gender balance because of that? Because you just said that there is indeed in Australia, there's even 70% participation, but it does not yet help to bridge the wage gap, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think there's a lot of, there's probably a lot of causal factors. So we could speak about overdetermination or something like that for the reason. But, you know, the fact that women are still responsible for social reproduction, you know, who is doing what, when and how, women still face an overwhelming burden of that social reproduction, including childbearing and caring for children. That means that they are not able to participate as fully and they have to take career breaks. I mean, for us in academia in Australia, the leaky pipeline can nearly be mostly down to women having children, to be quite honest. I don't know how it is in Indonesia, but yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we still have plenty of time for questions or comments from participants. I know certainly that there are some of our postgraduate students whose work does address the question of women in development. I would encourage them to perhaps share some of their experiences, insights from anything from designing research that focuses on women in development to the challenges of fieldwork and how to involve women in active research in the field, or to some of the experiences that they have and even questions that they have of how to try to understand phenomena that they witness in the field. Maybe just while we wait, maybe I'll just say something. I was really interested, Mel, from the beginning when you sent us your short explanation of what you would present in your webinar today, and you use the term add women and stir. And I think this is a really, really important thing because in Indonesia, and a lot of colleagues and scholars who are present in this forum would know this and have this experience, that the concept of gender mainstreaming in development programs is very much talked about, widely discussed. And in fact, many of the performance indicators for different kinds of programs show that the inclusion of women in development programs in many regions is already very high. However, when we actually look at the ground level, what we actually witness and experience is that the position of women doesn't change. And I think that sits in line with the work that you've done in several regions in the global south, in Southeast Asia, both in Indonesia and East Timor, and also in South Asia, in Myanmar, and also as far as the Middle East. Yeah. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about and tease out some of the issues in relation to why within development programs there is this big emphasis on gender mainstreaming, but then maybe just spell a little bit more about what really are the obstacles in terms of this actually taking place, both when you work with practitioners and women on the ground in terms of your field work, but also when you're analysing it and developing your frames of analysis and those theoretical three theoretical threads that you've talked about in your presentation today.
That's a pretty big question.
It doesn't have to be all of it. It's just the things that are going on in my mind.
Yeah, no,
so
I think
as little or as much as you want to.
I mean, what I'm struck by, like from my activist work a bit as well, like practitioner activist work as well as the scholarly work, is that in some sense you can try as hard as you like as a feminist scholar and work as hard as you want on some of this stuff, and it might not get anywhere. Like it's not necessarily that gender mainstreaming is a bad tool. It's also that there's a lot of resistance. So when I'm talking about, we shouldn't be surprised when we face challenges of transforming society, because look how entrenched, look how long patriarchy has been around, and how much benefit accrues to men from this system, right? So in one sense, I think, yeah, it's not for want of trying in a way that gender mainstreaming doesn't work. But I do see some issues with its conceptualization, as you kind of pointed to. You can't just add women and stir. It's not just about numbers, right? In the first sense, gender mainstreaming, because it has that term gender in it, gender doesn't mean women. Gender means power relations between men and women. So if we say, how do we mainstream critical thinking about power relations between men and women, is different than just, are there any women here? You know, so how do we mainstream that critique of gender power relations in everything that we do? And sometimes the UN and other international organisations or national governments do that better than other times. Sometimes they are aware of those power dynamics, and other times they just want to add women. So that would be the first kind of point, is that, yeah, we get a bit caught up with just adding women and stirring and not enough around the power. But even with just adding women, I do think there is a benefit in adding women. Having said that, you know, adding women does make a difference. Because if we've learned anything, I think, from the, you know, revolution in feminism and women's emancipation, it's that women collectively, as a group, are what are the driving force of our revolution, in a sense. You know, it's not individual women. So when you add women, you have more women, and when you have a group of women, you can push an agenda in a way that you cannot as on your own. So every time there is some gender mainstreaming and they give some more money to NGOs or to women's organisations and so on, I am hopeful, because those collective groups of women do push for change in really radical ways, I guess. And the third thing is, you mentioned obstacles, and that is that one step forward, two step back kind of thing. Given what I've said about how massive the change has been from, you know, accepted patriarchy, the idea that, you know, women actually were owned by men, that's only been overturned in, like, you know, a matter of decades, right? So we're not surprised about the resistance, and we also ought not to be surprised by backlash either. So when I look at the obstacles to gender mainstreaming and to women's changing politics in development and other spaces, most of what I see around the obstacles are, yeah, men's political resistance to women's emancipation. So that can take the form of actual violence. It can take the form of violence inside the home. It can take the form of violence against women political leaders. But it doesn't need to be violent either. It can also be, you know, a matter of exclusion, putting difficult barriers in the way, setting up a system so women can't participate because they've got too many obligations at home, etc. I think we had a question come through on the chat, no?
Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll read that out. So this is a question from Rosalie. Would you mind explaining whether certain religious beliefs or cultural beliefs have significant impact on presenting gender issues in Indonesia?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're probably almost better answered by the people who are researching this in Indonesia, but I can talk about some of the East Indonesia examples, I think. I guess, like, it depends on your theoretical approach a little bit. You know how I said earlier that I take a kind of like materialist approach. That is, I'm always thinking about money, violence and economics and stuff like that. Because of that, I'm not as focused on religious or cultural ideas being the main driving force. For me, it's much more about money and power. So when people say, oh, cultural beliefs have an impact on gender issues, you can say, yeah, they have an impact, but who has power inside that group? I think, you know, when we see the issue around feminism in Indonesia. Sometimes those groups who are mobilizing against feminism, they're talking that they're justifying it from a cultural or religious perspective, but what they're actually doing is advocating for men's power. And it might not necessarily come from being based on a cultural or religious point of view, but actually it's just about male supremacism. And I think we see that come through in quite a few different areas. Yeah. Rosalie, do you want to add something to your comment there?
Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can, Rosalie.
Okay. I think being in Indonesia was born like Chinese descendant, but was born in Indonesia. I think cultural beliefs really do, maybe lately, religious beliefs as well, really do has an impact on presenting numerous issues on gender, especially these days. I'm talking about when I was just in like primary schools, and today when I'm like the X generations as a college lecturer, those days are different. The gender issues around those eras are different, and mainly from my observations, the religious beliefs and also the cultures have a big impact. But I do agree on what Melissa mentions about the power and the money. I think that's an interesting way of looking at these problems as well. Thank you so much for the explanation.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rosalie. That's the thing, right? Like, I do think that religion and cultural belief have significant impact, but, you know, if we, as scholars, we look underneath, you know, if you can see that religious and cultural mobilization for men's rights come just at the time when women in Indonesia are getting more rights, this tells us that it's a backlash motivated by a struggle over power, right? And not just about the religious belief per se. Because men have lost, and I'm, you know, some people don't agree with me on this, but I think women's labour market participation does mean that men have to give up some power. Because they lose that power, it is no wonder they find some way, and men and women, to reinstate the older way of doing things. And for me, in Indonesia, I see that mobilisation being done through cultural and religious organisations in various forms. But yeah, it's a discussion point and not, you know, the facts. You know, it's a scholarly debate. You know.
Okay, we have another question from Rini, who's one of our scholars at Universitas Kristen Satyawacana, and she's asking, what is the connection in your view, or what is the connection and difference between developed and developing countries in terms of gender inequalities? How would you make some comparisons between the differences, or what would you see are the connections?
Yeah, I think, you know, like I said, patriarchy looks different in different places, and that gender inequality is like a stand-in for patriarchy, right? It looks different in different places, but all of it is about male supremacy. So I guess the connection is that we still have a lot of male supremacy in Australia, unfortunately, or in the US, or in the UK, or France, or wherever. But just that the way that manifests is different. I think some things around work and women's access to the labour market have changed quite a lot in developed countries, especially, say, Southeast Asia, women have a lot of labour market access, is not so bad. But say like North Africa and the Middle East, women are not allowed to participate as much in the labour market. So you see quite a gap there, for instance. But on the question, for instance, about violence against women, there is less gap. Actually, there is more in common. Still, women in Australia are killed at about a rate of 1 woman per week, and we only have 25 million people. So it's a really large number of women get killed by their current or former partner. So there, the connection or the gap is less big. And I do attribute that to the fact that everywhere we see patriarchy, and it is very entrenched and very hard to overcome. So it's no wonder that we see progress on some fronts and then not much progress in other fronts.
Urini, did you want to add something or respond to Mel's comment?
Thank you.
Thank you for the great presentations. I enjoy it very much.
Yeah. So Rini, what do you see as the difference between developed and developing countries in gender inequality?
Well, because as far as I noticed that the inequalities genders in developed countries, there are a lot of people stand up and they are so brave to speak up their inequalities, not in developing countries, especially in my countries, Indonesia. And when I was born as a Chinese, gender inequalities is not something that we are common to talk, and maybe we know that it's not. For example, in my family, my mother is my father actually is a Chinese. He was born in China, but in my opinion, my father is a feminist. So my father is the one that stand up for his children, because I have 5 brothers and I have 4 sisters. Actually, my mother's actually didn't agree that we are women can study into the university. So
Yeah, wow.
my father is a feminist. So my father stands up against his wife. So he fight for his children, his daughters, so we can study in the university.
Yeah.
So feminist inequalities is not something that we talk about, but in practice, people like in my cultures, something that this is something that we agree that inequalities, but in practice we try to fight in our ways to find the inequalities, gender inequalities. So I thank to my fathers that he is very feminist than my
I
mother.
thank your father too, because then you're here at the university. But I think that does point to an important thing, you know, like just because you're a woman doesn't automatically make you a feminist, and you can be a feminist man or a feminist ally if you're a man. Like it's the attitude about equality, not the gender, that makes the politics, right? And the fact that your father sees also this education as being a key kind of part for his daughters, and this makes him a feminist in your view, I think also speaks to what I mentioned about, you know, education being this key vector for us as a movement. You know, it is so important that, you know, then when you're at university, you also have your mind stimulated about ideas about equality or, you know, other kinds of justice issues in a way that if you had just gone and got married, you know, maybe you wouldn't have that same kind of exposure, right?
Yeah, I agree that education is one of the important key.
Yeah. Do you meet any other feminists at the university? Did it also stimulate your thinking around women's empowerment and things when you were studying?
I think sometimes I think, for examples like in like student body or any organizations, they try. I think they always choose men. They prefer men as leader, I think.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think that maybe inequalities is not spoken, but in reality, there are a lot of practice of gender inequality.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Those are great examples, Rennie. You really thought about that.
Yeah.
Those are great
also in church, I think many organizations it's not written, it's not spoken, but in practice there are a lot of gender inequalities.
I mean, it's interesting. Oh no, I won't go into just friends and participants, we have 10 minutes left for our webinar, so there's still an opportunity to ask some more questions or make a comment. I would really encourage you to talk about anything that relates to the topic that Mel has presented today, or your own work if you're addressing gender issues, or any questions if you're thinking about how your own scholarly work might consider more specifically this question of gender and the differences between men and women in the context of the research that you're conducting. And please do not feel that the contributions can only be from women. We have a number of our male scholars also present. If you have questions or comments that you would like to make, please feel free.
May I again, Rebecca? Well,
sure, Henry. Sure, no problem.
I'm based in Jakarta and have to deal a lot with the national government of Indonesia. For example, the National Planning Bureau. And there's currently a discussion going on about the next 5-year development plan for the country. And an issue that has come up is, should we go for gender mainstreaming? Or should we try to develop, let's say, what's the proper word, separate, should we focus on it differently? Let me call it like that. What would be your advice to the National Planning Bureau here? They're just entering this discussion. Anything you could suggest? We're talking about a national planning document, laying out the agenda for a lot of line ministries. Would they benefit from mainstreaming or gender mainstreaming, or would another approach be more relevant? Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've had a bit to do with the development of like different parts of Indonesian development policy when I was living in Kupang and doing some research in East Indonesia, right? And I have to say, overall, I was pretty impressed. Like, there were some parts that were bad, you know, not well organized or whatever, but I felt there was, among the bureaucrats and other people involved, quite a high level of awareness around gender equality, and good discussion between that NGO women's sector, which is amazing in Indonesia and very well developed, and those bureaucrats. So even though I think there's a lot that isn't working, which gender mainstreaming in Indonesia is actually not too bad. I wouldn't, you know, personally, I wouldn't start doing anything different, because people, you know, they kind of got their head around, okay, we have a gender focal point and we have some trainings, and, you know, we try and build the capacity in different levels of administration. What I probably would recommend is taking it a little bit further in some aspects, which is about moving beyond the women and stir kind of thing and doing a bit of an analysis, which would be instituting some gender responsive budgeting. I think Indonesia could really benefit from looking at the budgeting aspects of gender equality. And, you know, you can do that in a quite simple way, where you just have a gender budget statement at the beginning of each year and you count how much money is going towards different kinds of things. They have been doing this a little bit in Indonesia, I think, but it's not well implemented. So it would be, I think, a good step to try and move beyond just inclusion, to try and work out where the power is, you know, that money aspect again, where the power is, who's getting what, who's benefiting, etc. And that, I think, gender responsive budgeting does provide some great tools for that personally.
Okay, we still have time for 1 or 2 more comments or questions.
Anyone have a difficult research question about their fieldwork methods or something like that? I love those questions. And including gender. I have to wait till I come. Oh.
Okay, are there any several titles of feminist books that you would recommend for us to read that are related to gender and development?
Yeah, I can definitely send some along. I think, yeah, the classics. I love the classics. You know, the Maria Mies, is it, what is her book called? I forget what it is. I can tell the authors. Yeah, Maria Mies, Andrea Cornwall, who's a great scholar from International Institute Development Studies. I really also think that, reading those feminist economists' work. So that's Pearson, is it Elizabeth Pearson and Diane Elson, the classic, what do we do when we count women? Just some of that basic stuff. It gives you it's so simple and yet so effective when you put it in your research or put it in your planning. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much to read, actually. Naila Kabir. Yeah.
Maybe just in response to that as well, perhaps over the next little while, Mel and I can put together just some titles and topics, both of books and journal articles that people can access easily online, and that people can ask for that through the Fakultas Interdisiplin from our administrative staff, and we will be happy to share those. I'm also hoping that there will be an opportunity for us to host a further time with Mel and some of our research scholars based in Indonesia, but more in the form of a workshop, so that there is a chance for more interactions between people present in the forum. There may be an opportunity to do that face-to-face sometime next year, but otherwise, if that looks difficult or we'd like to hold one early in the year, we can look at the possibilities of doing something online as well as a daring forum. I think this is one of the things that we're recognizing, is that there is an increased, I don't think it's increased, maybe it's an increased interest or increased recognition amongst scholars that we need to think about women when we look at questions of development or the kinds of research topics that our postgraduate scholars and also our other academic scholars are conducting. Okay, we still have time for one more short question or comment. If anybody else has something else they would like to contribute before we end our webinar today.
I think I would add that look at the real life example we have about how hard it is to have feminist discussions when we get Zoom bombed by some idiot in the beginning trying to talk over the top of me and make the problem for the seminar, right?
Definitely. Absolutely. And that's a lesson for us. That's the first time something like that happened in the webinar. And I just want to thank our administrative staff for getting onto it very quickly and organizing multiple co-hosts so that we could exclude anybody who tried to do that again. But we were a little bit unprepared at the beginning.
So when you have a feminist discussion, right, this is get the backlash straight away.
Yeah. And it was also interesting that I don't think that they were from Indonesia. No. So there you go. Okay, Mel, it doesn't look like we have any more questions or comments at this stage. Perhaps you might want to say something just before we finish the webinar today.
Yeah, only that I am planning to come to Indonesia as one of my case studies for this big grant that I got, and I do hope to be based in Central Java for one of the case studies. So I hope to be around at your institution actually, quite a bit in the second half of the year. So I look forward to seeing you all then. You can bring all of your methods questions and research questions then, and we'll talk gender.
Fantastic. Okay, so we are just about out of time. So I'd like to take this opportunity in the first instance to thank our speaker today, Dr. Melissa Johnston. I think it was a very useful and engaging presentation that has got a lot of us thinking about many things. And also I got some notes from some of our scholars who couldn't actually tune in live because they have lots of background stuff going on where they are at the moment. But I think that it's piqued a lot of people's interest, and that many people will be interested to do follow-up discussions next year. I think that will be fantastic. Also, thank you very much to everyone who's participated today, to those who've contributed questions and made comments during the discussion. I think that we usually like to take a photo of the participants at the end of the session. If I could possibly ask Mbak Raras or Mbak Ayu, if they could do this for us, perhaps you could turn your microphone on and assist us to take a photo of the participants of our webinar. Or Bu Rini, somebody.
Okay, I will take the photo, or Mbak Raras. Mbak Raras.
Okay, so maybe we could ask everybody who is able to turn your cameras on.
Yeah. Okay, I will count to 3. 1, 2, smile. Yeah, I think finish, Bu Becca.
Okay, thanks so much, Burini. Just also to remind people that there is an e-certificate available for this webinar. There is a link in the chat. If you'd like to click the link before we end this webinar, you can complete the form and that will be sent to you. Okay, once again, thanks so much, Melissa, for your participation in our webinar series for the 65th anniversary of Universitas Kristen Satya Wacana. Thanks again to all of our participants. We hope to see you at further forums like this in the new year. Oh, sorry, into next year. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay,